that has also used victim language to divert attention of responsibilities. I'm looking forward to this conversation today. My name is Jody Evans, and I'm one of the co-founders of Code Pink and part of the Feminist Foreign Policy. We are hosting these conversations to answer the question, what is a feminist foreign policy? And I'm thrilled to introduce you to these two amazing women. The first, Sarah Schulman, a brilliant novelist, playwright, screenwriter, activist, and educator, is from New York City. She's the co-founder of Lesbian Avengers, a direct action organization that fought for lesbian survival and visibility, and was an active member of ACT UP, of which she's now about to publish a new book about its history, which I look forward to. And she was also in action against the First Gulf War. She currently sits on the advisory board of Jewish Voices for Peace, one of our sister organizations. And I just want to thank you, Sarah, for listening to the call of the BDS movement and canceling your trip to Israel many years ago at the beginning of the movement. That took a lot of courage. Her book, Conflict is Not Abuse, Overstating Harm, Community Responsibility, and the Duty of Repair, argues that the overstatement of harm is used to avoid accountability in intimate and global relationships. And it's what calls us to talk to her today. And then I want to introduce you to Sierra Taylor, who's a popular educator, organizer, and artist, also based in New York City, where she works at the People's Forum, a working class movement incubator, and who first became politically active as a teenager in a stand against the Iraq War, and later co-founded Dream Defenders, a Florida-based youth organization that seeks to end policing and prisons, and started in 2012 after the murder of Trayvon Martin. She was also one of the co-producers of the Iraq Tribunal in 2016 to point out the lies and costs of the Iraq War. Her work focuses on militarism, poverty, mass incarceration, and we're excited she could join us today. So welcome, both of you, and thank you. Before we start to dig into the conversation, Sarah, I wonder if you could briefly give us a framework of conflict is not abuse.
Okay, so it's basically a two-part argument. So I wrote it in the summer of 2014, so 2 years before Trump was elected. And I looked at three events. The first was when NFL player Ray Rice was videotaped punching his wife in an elevator, knocking her unconscious, and dragging her out by her heels. The second was the murders of Eric Garner and Michael Brown. And the third was the 2014 Israeli war on Gaza, the aerial war in which 2,000 civilians were murdered or more. But I looked at all those three events, from the most intimate to the governmental. I saw that in all three cases, the perpetrators imagined themselves to be the ones who were under attack. They saw themselves as threatened or endangered when actually they were the parties that were dangerous and that were causing the pain. And I became very interested in this mentality of people in powerful positions and dominant cultural positions or physically dominant positions, theorizing themselves as victims in order to justify completely unjustifiable hostilities and even mortal aggression. Then, of course, we have Donald Trump, who's the ultimate of this, who's always telling us that it's a witch hunt and he's a victim and everything's stacked against him while he is the ultimate perpetrator. So that's sort of the initial framework. The secondary idea is looking at what is the cause of this. Like we know, for example, that when a white policeman sees a black man reading a book in a car and shoots him, it's his internal racism that is creating the anxiety. It's within him. And yet he's attributing it to something external, the fact that this black person exists. He inherently experiences that as an anxious threat. But I also found that often when we really look at why people develop this position, we can see that it comes from two places, from dominance and from trauma. So in many cases, dominant people feel that if they're being opposed in any way or questioned or being made to question themselves, they're being assaulted or attacked or they're being abused, that they should be comfortable at all times. They feel unconsciously that it is their inherent right to always be comfortable and never have to question themselves. But as philosopher Sarah Ahmed has pointed out, the only way that a person can always be comfortable is if other people are suppressed. Being permanently comfortable is not a healthy social dynamic. If we really are aware of other people's needs and their feelings and their realities, then we would always be in a state of discomfort because we're constantly negotiating difference. So that's one side, this kind of idea that if you're being questioned or you're being made to question yourself, you're being opposed or you're being attacked or abused is a dominance position. But it can also be a position that comes from trauma. Because sometimes when we're so traumatized that we can barely keep it together and we have problems that we cannot solve, being addressed directly or being asked to be self-critical can feel so threatening that we can actually feel like we're in danger, even though it's simply that the other person has another way of looking at things. So that whether it comes from trauma or whether it comes from dominance, what we really need is a reassessment of the role of criticism, questioning, and discomfort as healthy and really normal parts of social dynamics.
Oh, wow. Thanks for laying that out so well, Sarah. You know, we at Code Pink and also at the Feminist Foreign Policy Project, it's like we notice that these questions don't even arise. When Obama was threatening that red line, that Syria had crossed the red line and they were going to bomb it, we were outside, literally camping outside of Congress as he's inviting everyone in the White House to argue that he should have the right to bomb Syria. And we got one member of Congress to take in 10 points of diplomacy had these things been addressed. And when I gave it to him, he says, no, I'm sure these have been addressed. And when he showed them to Obama, they said no, and they were studying them, like, you know, oh, really? So it's just not even in the culture to have the space of like, have conversation. And one of the things we look for with the Feminist Foreign Policy is to revive even what is a conversation? What does diplomacy even look like? And do we live in such a traumatized world that we can't even come together around a table and talk?
Well, right now we conflate being self-critical with blame. That if you have to look at your part in escalating some kind of event, or which we all are part of, that somehow it becomes your fault. And similarly, we feel like we're not being heard unless the people who we have grievances against are being punished. Right now, if somebody else is punished, incarcerated or shunned or expelled or whatever, that is the proof that we've been heard. And if we could only separate actually being heard and having our needs met from having to punish other parties, because they really are two separate phenomena.
Powerful. That's like, let that drop. Thank you. So Sierra, your work with police and prison abolition kind of dovetails really nicely with what Sarah says. How do you see the overstatement of harm show up in local communities, or also, you know, we did that work on Iraq and the community towards war and militarism?
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me in this conversation. And, you know, Jody, for bringing up this current moment that we're in. You know, we're in the midst of a pandemic. We're in the midst of an economic crisis. We're in the midst of uprising. As Jody pointed out, we've had 200,000 people die from this pandemic in this country. We have, 1.7 newly unemployed people within this last week. Meanwhile, billionaire growth since the beginning of this pandemic in March has now grown to 3 $3.917 trillion. And so I think, as Sarah pointed out, and sort of like our relationships, oftentimes people, when we don't have answers to our problem, will resort to this victimization. And I think with this pandemic, with this economic crisis, with the recent uprisings, we're seeing that those in power who have been maintaining this system don't have any answers, for those crises that they, had an intimate relationship in constructing. And so you're now seeing the rise of police brutality, or at least, we're literally seeing it, and, it still persists, mass incarceration. And, I think it's important to point out, you also see this radical inclusiveness happening with people, whether, in our communities, neighbors making, checking in on neighbors, making sure that people have enough to eat, and that people are feeling well, to being out in the streets. You're able to see all these people, across historic lines of division by race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, age, ability. You're seeing all of us come together in this moment, as I think we're starting to see, under this economic crisis and pandemic, how, our different oppressions are connected at the root. Maybe we don't even realize that consciously. Maybe it's just a subconscious thing, but I think those in power definitely are conscious about this element. And that creates real fear and panic. We only, know this crisis is going to get worse. What's going to happen, when unemployment runs out, when people don't have access to food, or as people are getting kicked out of their apartments, when the rent freezes, stops, where is society going to be then? I think they're recognizing that if we're able to come together in this moment, when shit isn't as bad as it could be, the potential of us really uniting and coordinating, scares the shit out of them. And so you see in the media, you see with these politicians on quote unquote both sides, using this language of the good protester versus the bad protester, the Black Lives Matter terrorists, the violence of Antifa, really trying to criminalize dissent, criminalize protest under these terrible conditions that they've created, as a way to, increase our fear of one another, increase our fear for standing up for one another. And I think also to try to reinforce, the division, this all white, all class division that was really created, with the development of this economic system and racialized chattel slavery. And so, I think, while we have these conversations about structural white supremacy, I think, two things we need to keep in mind. I think the first thing is, when we talk about structure, it's not a static thing. It's something that's ever growing, ever evolving, experimenting, changing its shape, as, time goes on, as the context changes. You see the way in which, this structures, they change, but there's always a through line. That through line is the need for these people in power to maintain and increase profit, and to maintain social control. And I think another aspect of that, and how they keep social control, is through white supremacy. And so I think conversation in this moment is so important, because white supremacy may on the surface show benefits, to white folks. In reality, this racism is keeping not only us divided, but is allowing white people to continue to be oppressed as well, and continue to have shitty jobs as well, no healthcare as well, because it's like, oh, at least you're not this group. And so we have to have conversations to realize that our oppressions may not look the same, but systemically, structurally, they are connected at the root.
So Sierra, after reading Sarah's book, like what's one takeaway you got for your work in this? Like what, is there something that you're going to be able to take into your work that's useful just in what you were saying?
Yeah, I think this thought around the political being manipulated or, hidden as personal issues, I think is really huge. I think that's something that, we're seeing in the movement today. Some of the most radical organizations that are doing real work to unite poor and working class people, you're seeing them, undergoing these attacks now, where people are bringing up abuse, you know this policing, the need to have safety, and instead of having critical, constructive conversations. One of the most disturbing practices I've been seeing as of late is this culture of believe women, and you know which women which women are we believing, and whose interests are they working, for, and whose interests are they making, these different statements? How do we think critically when someone, has a politic or brings up an argument? How do we actually think critically and engage in that? Not all politics of oppressed people are necessarily the politics that we need for peace, for accountability. And there's a real need for our society to collectively, engage, in real conversation about, what's really going on. And I've seen this sort of idea of abuse without real definition come into play in these sort of movement spaces. And there are some people who, I think this is like political police intelligentsia, maybe I'm paranoid, but people who are coming in and saying, oh, anyone that's caused harm within organizations, they need to be put on a list so that all organizations know who they are and can make sure that, they don't come into your organization and, abuse or harm anyone else. Again, what are we describing as harm? How are we defining abuse? How are we complexifying, problematizing like what's really going on, what's really happening? And so, these are real political questions, but people think about them as individual, personal beef that, I think you bring up in relation to intimate partner abuse. Is sort of outside the realm of accountability, because it's a personal thing and needs to be separate from the political. And so I think that was one of the main takeaways that, I really want to have real, conversation and practice, be in practice within the movement.
Thank you so much. So let me just get out an easy definition. So abuse is power over. It means no matter what you do, there's nothing you can do to de-escalate the situation. So if a policeman shoots a black person who's walking down the street, there's nothing that person did to cause that situation, and there's nothing they could have done to avoid it. It's abuse. Conflict is power struggle. It's when both parties are in some way contributing to the escalation, and both parties have the power to help things de-escalate. So those are the definitions that I'm using. I think, one of the reasons that I think that people are escalating or overstating what's going on is because we're in this very strange cultural frame where only if you're a clean, pure victim who did not participate in any way in escalation are you eligible for compassion. The bar is very, very high. I say, we have to really lower that bar, because if people ask for help, they should have it. People who need support should get it. You shouldn't have to prove that you're completely innocent because you could be suffering from conflict. Conflict can be extremely painful. It can be debilitating. So, that's one of the factors. You brought up believe women, and I just want to go into that in a little more depth. So obviously women have not been believed historically and are still not believed today when they talk about real abuse that women are experiencing in all kinds of ways, not just sexual abuse and sexual harassment, but sexism itself. However, there's also a history, for example, of white women making false accusations or making accusations that they felt were true that have been used to justify racism, racial murder, colonialism. Women can become tools of systems of oppression. So when somebody makes an accusation, and we are in the age of accusation today, accusations are flying high and wide. We're not in an age of compassion, identification, or understanding. But when someone makes an accusation, I really think the first thing you do is you ask people, why do you think this is happening? The first thing is to just let everyone speak and have them say what they understand is going on, and then try to draw some conclusion from there. And that requires community. So whether it's something like the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, which requires the international community to participate in the boycott of Israel, the Israeli state, in order to support justice for Palestine. It's the same as when it's a group of your friends and people are saying, oh, you should be horrible to that person because I used to go out with them. Like you're always being asked like, oh, don't invite her. Or, why are you working with him? That's this type of thing. The community has to intervene with the expectation of negotiation, the expectation that we will help each other communicate instead of the expectation that we will join together in some kind of false loyalty to increase the pain, which is where we are right now.
So beautifully said. Thank you. One of the things about your book is repair. And so when you talk about the place that we're in, what are some steps we can take to get out of this space of accusation into the space of healing? Because it's kind of it's the war economy versus the peace economy, and we need a bridge where we've literally been eaten alive, or we're all participating in what I call the war economy, the oppressive, destructive, extractive economy, and we've embodied the patterns. And you talk about in the book, the oppressor, like how the roles could switch back and forth. And so, what is the bridge to the future of like creating a peace economy?
I really agree with Ciara 100% that the repair is within this huge coalition, big tent movement that we are building. And I want to say, I just finished a huge book on the history of ACT UP New York. It's 750 pages, 20 years in the making, and it's coming out in May. But there's a real lesson to be learned from the AIDS activist movement, because very interestingly, ACT UP did not operate on consensus. People were not expected to agree on strategies or to unite on programs. There was one line of unity, which was direct action to end the AIDS crisis. And if what you were doing was direct action to end the AIDS crisis, pretty much it was okay. So interestingly, the way that this played out, so the organization was basically between 400 and 800 hardcore members who came to meetings every week. And the biggest demonstration had 7,000 people. So we're talking about a small vanguard movement. If you wanted to interrupt Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral, as ACT UP did, to protest the church's battle to keep condoms out of the public schools, and I thought that was a terrible idea, I would not try to stop you from doing it. I just wouldn't do it. If instead I thought we should be doing needle exchange on the Lower East Side, which ACT UP did do, and you didn't want to do that, you just wouldn't do it. So strategies were not opposing each other. You didn't have to choose, and not everyone was expected to do the same thing. Instead, there was a simultaneity of response, because people can only be where they're at. And that's like the hardest lesson in politics to learn, because we all want everyone to be exactly where we are, use the words that we have our analyses, and choose our strategies. But it's never going to be that way. And the bigger the movement is, and I agree with you, Ciara, this movement has incredible potential the more different points of view there are going to be. And so we need to have appreciation for multiple approaches at the same time that are not contradictory. So for example, obviously, I think all of us here are abolition people, but not everyone in the movement understands that. And the best way to put out those politics is to explain them, to enact them, and to have actions in those directions. But if somebody else is not there, it doesn't mean that they're a terrible, bad person. You don't take them down, call them names, troll them on Twitter or whatever. Let them do their actions. Because the truth is, the further to the left is in a functional, effective, and active way, the more viability the center has. If the left is chaotic or moves to the center moves to the right. So, we are dynamic with the center. The left and the center are dynamic with each other, and there needs to be an understanding relationship.
Thank you. But I get that it's the movement, but are there any, for the listeners, things that they could embody? Have you seen for yourself or in your teaching recommendations of how to listen or how to talk, or certainly to be able to be a big tent is huge. And that itself would have a big effect that we don't, Sierra and I, we live by that. It's like that we nurture each other, and that, everyone's working in the same direction from the place they are. But are there other things the people listening could embody?
Well, one thing is, people are, I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier, we're constantly being asked to hurt people. This person is terrible, they're trash, they're a garbage person, they're a cop, they're this, they're that. Don't participate in that. If you're being asked to hurt somebody, call the person you're being asked to hurt and ask them why they think this is happening. This is so much about corruption from the top, trickling down into our relationships, our social relationships. And, a lot of the support for the state of Israel is based on this idea that, you're from Jews, that if you're loyal and you love your family, you will support Israel because you're in that same group, and this is the clique mentality, it's the community mentality, it's the racial supremacy mentality, that because there's a group of people that you identify with, even if it's in a negative way, you're supposed to hate other people or hurt other people because your group has decided that. And it works in families the same way, this kind of negative group relationship, and that's the thing to resist.
Yes, huge. So, Sierra, do you have any other comments about what you learned from the book? Because you did mention your fear of how personally it would affect your relationship. Was there something you wanted to share about that?
Yeah. Like I said, before we, started recording, I was very just nervous about reading this book because I'm just like, oh shit, what is this going to tell me about myself and how I, relate with other people? And lo and behold, it did tell me a lot, about myself, or at least, a way for me to really think critically about my actions. I think, as Sarah pointed out, sometimes we don't even understand the way that we think, or, even recognize, our thoughts. Like, it's so subconscious. And, Kwame Ture or Stokely Carmichael, and I have a lot of disagreements with his politics and, some whatever, but he said that the role of the revolutionary is not to make the unconscious conscious, but to make the unconscious conscious of their unconscious behavior. And so I think it's, really needing to examine, like, where are our beliefs coming from? Where does our value system come from? If we believe that the ruling, ideas, or the ruling are the ideas of those in power, then we have to be able to identify, okay, in whose interest are the ideas or practices that I have? and whose interests are they serving? And so when I think about, how do we really apply these lessons to, our lives and being able to engage in conflict, I think, there is the element of you need to actually be engaged in struggle together. It's not like, oh, let's wait until you're healed of your white supremacy before we're able to engage in organizing work. And, I have a sort of a, I don't know what you call it, like what I do like in these moments. So, my belief is that we need to unite all who are poor and dispossessed. And so when I'm talking about engaging in struggle together, it's like, if you are working class, if you are, poor, and marginalized, then we're on the same side and we have to struggle together. Or, conversely, like, even if you're, of a more privileged class or wealthy, but you're in this struggle to end poverty, then I'm going to interact with you. Now, like, if you're in a privileged class and you're not engaging in that struggle, then I don't personally interact with those folks. I don't think that that's really where my time should be spent. I'm not out here chasing the Jay-Z and Beyoncés and the Obamas, because those just aren't my people. And I think what we have to recognize is, when we talk about white supremacy being structural, like, let's think about that. Let's think about, the institution of white supremacy. Like, I'm sorry, if there's a poor white person, who uses the N-word, that is different for me than, a Black politician operating in, redlining districts and preventing people from the right to vote. Like, this is actually serving the interests of white supremacy. And so this white person who might say that, nigger or whatever is more, closer to me and my struggle and who I actually need to engage than, folks who are, actually institutionally, systemically enacting oppression against me, who actually has decision-making capacities. And so when I say engage and struggle together, like, let's build, let's actually go out in the streets. Like, it takes action. Struggle is also study. Like, how are we engaging and learning our history together? How are we engaging and understanding this movement together? I think that it is through, struggle, through conflict, through being able to lift up these contradictions and be able to problematize instead of just looking at the surface level. I think that is where we actually are able to build pathways to peace in this time, like, not waiting for, we got to wait for socialism, or we got to wait for the revolution, but how, as Code Pink does, how are we actually building democracy in the moment that we're in, and that has a lot to do on the basis of how we engage each other on these different human levels.
So I think you just nailed something super important, which is about education. And I think that's one of the things that is so missing, because we're not educated to have conflict, which is what education is, in a sense, is to, chew up against ideas and find your own experience of them. And education too often is just the download of ideas so you can take a test and get it right and get an A. And that whole system is probably contributed in some way to, I think, what Sarah's pointing out. Sorry, Sarah, I didn't mean to.
No, it's fine. I just was really glad that you brought up this question about social relationships in political movements, because, a lot of us have been outside of electoral politics for many, many years. And here we are, suddenly there's this whole new group of incredibly great young women of color who are coming into the Congress. People like Cori Bush who are coming from the movement. This was not possible until now. And this, I think, changes our relationships to elected officials, to people like AOC. And, we may not agree with everybody all the time, but they can express values that we haven't heard in Congress before. And it's very exciting to readjust to this possibility.
Just want to raise up a member of Congress, Pramila Jayapal, who's one of the co-founders of Code Pink, who's been created the space also that they don't get co-opted. I think that there have been some that have been elected, but it's also, if there's not enough of a community inside, co-optation is easy. So it's cool to see that there's enough of a mass that they can be a community inside of the craziness of Congress. So I just want to thank you both for joining. And when I mentioned education, I think everybody needs to go out and read Sarah's book. She mentioned she started writing it in 2014, and it's probably even more true and more needed than when she wrote it. It's ringing many bells of what we live inside of personally, communally, globally, and certainly a reflection of how the man with the orange hair uses and abuses power. So thank you, Sarah, for who you are, who you've been, and all the ways you helped to educate us to be the best activists for change we can be. And thank you, Sierra, for all you're doing in the streets and your education and elevation and inspiration. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both. Take care.
Bye, thank you.